God has wrought many things out of oppression. He has endowed his creatures with the capacity to create, and from this capacity has flowed the sweet songs of sorrow and joy that have allowed man to cope with his environment and many different situations. Jazz speaks for life. It is no wonder that so much of the search for identity among American Negroes was championed by jazz musicians. Much of the power of our freedom movement in the United States has come from this music. It has strengthened us with its sweet rhythms when courage began to fail. It has calmed us with its rich harmonies when spirits were down. And now, jazz is exported to the world.
With oppressive Jim Crow laws and increasing levels of violence from white supremacist groups, African Americans were growing wary of their lives in the South. With lackluster economic opportunities pushing them away from their homes and new jobs in the industrial sector opening up in cities pulling them towards new ones, the turn of the century saw African Americans flocking to the North in record numbers in a move known as the Great Migration. Due to segregation policies, these incoming populations were often relegated to the inner city slums, the most famous of which being Harlem, which found itself harboring hundreds upon thousands of African Americans, including vivacious communities of writers, artists, actors, dancers, and musicians.
Driven by, in the words of Elaine Locke, the necessity for fuller, truer self-expression, the realization of the unwisdom of allowing social discrimination to segregate him mentally, and a counter-attitude to cramp and fetter his own living, these groups work to change social disillusionment to race pride and create a realistic expression of their individual dark-skinned selves in what became known as the Harlem Renaissance, where literature, art, and music exalting African American traditions and identity gained nationwide recognition and popularity. One of these art forms that reached apotheosis in American culture was jazz, a genre built on improvisation and syncopation, finding its roots in indigenous African musical traditions and older African American styles such as work songs and spiritual music.
By bringing the works of exceptional jazz artists to the public eye, particularly that of white audiences, the Harlem Renaissance paved the way for African American musicians to showcase their skills and gain recognition and regard, which ultimately assisted in the decades-long battle for equal rights. Although the early 20th century was fraught with discrimination and segregation, African American jazz musicians helped break down racial barriers by gaining widespread respect for their art and culture, elevating their status in society, and providing a platform to spread support and recognition for the civil rights movement.
As jazz bloomed into one of the most popular musical styles due to its unique blend of improvisation, avant-garde rhythms such as syncopation, and rich cultural roots, its musicians rocketed into stardom. Throughout the Harlem Renaissance and into the 60s, the genre continued to produce some of the first pop stars, many of whom directly or indirectly used their platform to promote racial equality.
One of the African American jazz musicians in vogue was Fats Waller. Born Thomas Wright Waller on May 21, 1904, to an organist and a Baptist preacher, music was in his blood, and by the age of 20 he'd already recorded a solo debut and many piano rolls. Waller really came into his fame in 1926 when he recorded well-known tunes like Ain't Misbehavin', Jitterbug Waltz, Honeysuckle Rose, and The Joint is Jumpin' with the RCA Victor label. He was a virtuoso piano player and organist, renowned for his stride piano style and sense of humor, and was able to popularize jazz music among both black and white audiences during a time when the genre's notoriety was just beginning to burgeon. Though he died on December 15, 1943 at 39 years old, Waller had already contributed to the pursuit of equality for African Americans.
In 1938, he became the first African American to purchase a home in the elite community of Adison Park in New York City, despite racially restricted property laws beginning to set barriers for anyone attempting to do the same. After the Supreme Court case Shelley v. Kramer negated these laws in 1948, a swell of other black jazz musicians surged into the community. The precedent Waller set, an African American owning a home in an upper-class white neighborhood, was radical at the time and opened the door to opportunities for other jazz musicians, breaking the boundary of racial segregation common in the early 20th century. Additionally, Waller, along with lyricists Andy Razaf and Harry Brooks, composed what is regarded as the first jazz protest song, Black and Blue. What is in my face? He never got the chance to record it live, although other people have covered it. In an era when racial inequality was largely pushed aside by the general public, Black and Blue addressed the stereotypes pushed upon Black Americans. Though it never reached the billboards, the song is one of the first instances of popular protest music, preaching the plight of African Americans and breaking the barriers of the music industry. Finally, Waller was the first African American composer to write a score for a Broadway musical intended for white audiences, a revolutionary feat even as late as 1943. The show was entitled Early to Bed and was well liked by critics and commercially successful during its one-year run. If Waller had lived past the year, he would have been likely to be involved in the production of another musical, as the Broadway producer, Richard Colmar, was actively arranging for the jazz musician to compose 2 additional musicals. It demonstrates yet another barrier Waller broke in the commercial world, and the start of normalization of African American musicians in what was considered the highbrow music and theater industry.
A later jazz musician who broke racial barriers was Ella Fitzgerald. Born on April 15, 1917 in Newport News, Virginia, though she later moved to New York, Fitzgerald got her start by performing during amateur nights at different venues across the city, particularly at the Apollo Theater. This earned her a lot of attention, as well as an invitation to join Chick Webb's band, where she recorded different popular tunes such as A Tisket a Tasket, and even led the band for a short period after the titular musician died in 1939. During the 1940s, she went solo and became world-renowned for her voice, enjoying decades of popularity before her death on June 15, 1996. This same popularity allowed her to achieve heights that hadn't been possible for African American women in decades previous.
In addition to her own success, Fitzgerald contributed indirectly to the fight for racial equality that was pushed through associates and friends. For example, Norm Grant, who in 1945 became her manager, was a civil rights activist and aggressively pushed for her shows to be integrated and resisted attempts at discrimination from venues. This allowed Fitzgerald to compete in the music industry on a much more level playing field, and between the combination of her talent and Grant's campaigning, she was able to perform in different venues that had previously denied African American musicians performances. One such venue was the Mocambo nightclub in Los Angeles, though Fitzgerald, being able to perform, wasn't assisted by Grant so much as one of her fans, Marilyn Monroe. By promising to attend every night, sporting a front row seat, which would inevitably attract attention for the club, the starlet was able to use her influence in Hollywood to get Fitzgerald to become the first black musician to perform at the exclusive venue. This was a landmark move in breaking racial barriers and cleared a more welcoming path for the many other African American performers who entered the industry in her wake.
I see trees of green.
Another barrier-breaking musician, quite possibly the most famous of his time, was Louis Satchmo Armstrong. Born on August 4, 1901 in the city of New Orleans, he lived and breathed music, singing on the streets with his friends as a young boy and even joining a band as a teenager. This caught the attention of another musician, Joseph King Oliver, who took Armstrong under his wing and taught him how to read music and develop his playing technique. Under his tutelage, Armstrong's talent blossomed, particularly his ability to improvise. Prior to Armstrong, jazz had been mainly orchestral. No musician had ever soloed for an extended period, an example of a musical barrier Armstrong was undeterred by. Because of his deviation from the norm, Armstrong quickly rose to fame throughout the 1920s and 30s. Later, he became famous for his virtuoso trumpet playing and infusing scat singing, a style built on nonsense syllables and improvisation, into jazz. Even before the height of his fame, he was easily recognizable with his iconic gravelly voice and his use of swinging riffs and melodic variations. He always played emotionally, giving each piece personality and character. With his technique, Armstrong inspired later singers like Ella Fitzgerald, Billie Holiday, Bing Crosby, and many others.
In the context of civil rights, Armstrong, at first, was not particularly outspoken or politically active. This proved to be quite the source of conflict between him and other young African American musicians throughout the 1950s. However, the tables turned when an unsuspecting Armstrong was interviewed by 21-year-old jazz fan Larry Lubenow on September 17, 1957. When Lubenow mentioned Little Rock High School, where the governor of Arkansas, Orville Faubus, had ordered the National Guard to block African American students from entering, he got quite the response. Armstrong, using very colorful language, heavily criticized Eisenhower and Faubus, proclaiming, "The way they are treating my people in the South, the government can go to hell," and becoming the first African American performer of such popularity to be deliberately outspoken at the time, even canceling his goodwill tour to the Soviet Union in protest. Once Lubenow's story found its way to the media, it caused quite the stir. Some stations tossed out Armstrong's records. Even other African Americans denounced him for his bold words. While his outspokenness received criticism, it also received a great deal of support, and never once did Armstrong deny his words when confronted by critics. The fact that Armstrong, a world-renowned musician, had chosen to speak out meant that the civil rights movement was receiving renewed attention on a global scale. Finally, on September 24th, Eisenhower sent federal troops into Little Rock to protect the African American students, a decision that some believe was helped along by the musician's harsh public criticism. Louis Armstrong is a prime example of an African American musician who not only broke musical barriers but used his fame to break racial ones too.
In conclusion, although the early 20th century was fraught with discrimination and segregation, African American jazz musicians helped break down racial barriers by gaining widespread respect for their art and culture, elevating their status in society, and providing a platform to spread support and recognition for the civil rights movement. In the short term, jazz musicians made leaps upward on the social ladder that weren't feasible to the average African American citizen due to the racism of the period. This was just one of the many ways these musicians broke barriers and inspired others to do the same. Due to the demand for jazz music by audiences everywhere, Black performers were also integrated into the commercial music industry because of their talent and ability to bring in profits. In the long term, jazz's massive growth and popularity allowed African American musicians to garner a widespread audience, helping to not only bolster support for the advances they made within the civil rights movement, but also to break racial barriers by unifying Black and white audiences alike through a shared experience. What's more, the earliest popular artists such as Fats Waller and Louis Armstrong helped pave the way for later Black performers such as Ella Fitzgerald and Billie Holiday, as well as to set down the musical roots that musicians such as Chuck Berry would take and alter to create the popular style of rock and roll that would explode in later decades. However, more than anything, jazz was a medium that allowed African Americans to showcase their unique identity and experiences during a time when the remnants of an oppressive social system still shackled them to the past in a second-class existence.